Born in Vienna in 1918, Peter Blau was imprisoned and tortured in 1938 when Hitler took over Austria, but the next year was released and left with his sister for England, eventually immigrating to Illinois. He completed a bachelor's degree in sociology at Elmhurst College in 1942. In 1943, he became a U.S. citizen and later earns a Bronze Star as an Army translator in Europe, but the rest of his family perished at Auschwitz. After the war, he completed his Ph.D. at Columbia University in 1952 and then spent nearly 2 decades teaching at the University of Chicago. Judith Fritz was born in Michigan in 1942, the same year that Blau earned his bachelor's degree. She attended the University of Chicago while he was teaching there, earning her own bachelor's degree in 1964 and a master's degree in 1967. The next year, she married Peter Blau and became Judith Blau. Peter returned to Columbia University 2 years later in 1970 and taught there until 1988. Judith moved to New York with him. She taught classes at the City University of New York, then joined the sociology department at SUNY Albany. In 1988, Peter retired from Columbia. He and Judith both moved to Chapel Hill, where she became a full professor in the sociology department. He was an emeritus professor in the department until his death in 2002. Judith Blau continues to teach at Chapel Hill. They wrote this article in 1982 while they were in New York. It presents a clear and well-documented case for the argument that it is not poverty that causes high crime rates in U.S. cities, but the size of the gap between rich and poor. They argue that when that gap is also linked to ascribed characteristics like race, the potential for violent crime increases even more. Judith Blau conducted this research more than 30 years ago. The United States had one of the highest rates of violent crime in the world. The same remains true today, so when they decided to look into this problem, they were tackling what has proved to be an enduring and embarrassing feature of American society. As sociologists interested above all in the large-scale structure of a society, they did not think of this problem in terms of the special circumstances that lead one particular person or another to commit one particular crime. Their research question is not a whodunit mystery such as might appear in a detective novel. They wish to explain rather why the United States should have a high rate of crime in the population despite the wealth and prosperity of American society. They spell out their structural explanation of factors that might affect crime levels in any society. Structural explanations all have a couple of common features. First, such explanations measure large-scale aggregate properties of a society as a total system, such as the ratio of younger to older people, or the distribution of people across different occupations, or the level of economic output per capita, and so on. These are all facts that you can't measure or observe by looking at any one individual person. You can only see structural facts by looking at the societal forest rather than the individual trees. Second, since structural explanations are observed and measured only at the aggregate societal level, they typically concern objective material conditions of life, such as the average age of houses or the density of population per square mile in a city. But before the Blaus spell out their structural explanation for high crime rates, they run through a series of other explanations for violent crime that were widespread in the popular imagination at the time, and that still commonly are proposed to explain the problem today. We already have encountered these alternative ideas that explain crime and other social features of urban societies as the result of subjective attitudes and values of individuals, particularly as such attitudes and values arise as part of different subcultures that form within our growing cities. They consider 3 such cultural explanations of high crime rates in particular. They cite some research proposing that there is a regional subculture that is more tolerant of violent behavior in general in the southern states of the United States. This obviously will not explain the high crime rate for American society as a whole, unless such crimes concentrate disproportionately in these southern states. The literature exploring a possible southern subculture of violence is very complex and well developed, so this is not something they're just making up on the spur of the moment. Many other scholars have wondered about this same issue. There are a variety of statistical patterns that point in this direction, and not all of them have anything to do with crimes. For example, the southern states were and are much more likely to allow corporal punishment of students in schools. Support for the Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms as an individual personal freedom is generally higher in the South, as is attendance at public gun shows. Rates of service in the U.S. Armed Forces are significantly higher for the populations of southern states than for the rest of the country. The Blaus are not concerned to explain where this violent southern subculture might have come from, though it is a fascinating subject. They only propose to test whether it might help to explain the high rate of violent crimes observed in the country. On the other hand, they point out this whole idea of a subculture of violence may be a complete fiction, since we also know that the southern states have poorer, less educated populations than other regions of the country. If violent crime is purely an economic problem, related somehow to income, employment, and poverty, then there may be no actual difference between crime rates of people in different regions who share common economic circumstances. Following the same line of reasoning, they also consider the explanation offered by some other researchers that links violent crime to a violent urban subculture prevalent in segregated minority neighborhoods in American cities. Elijah Anderson's work on the Code of the Street already exposed us to the debate about whether this kind of subculture exists or not, and whether it might explain the high level of violent crime in American society. Again, the crime would have to concentrate disproportionately in these neighborhoods for such an explanation to work. And even if we did find more crime in these places, the subcultural explanation might not be necessary or useful if it turned out, once again, that crime was related to other economic or social circumstances, such as poverty or single-mother families or something else besides ethnicity itself that could be related to violent behavior. There may be no actual difference between crime rates for white, black, Hispanic, or Native American members of such disadvantaged households. Since the poverty argument keeps cropping up as a possible counter-argument to these other subcultural explanations, such as region or ethnicity, the Blaus go on to add a third and final version of subcultural explanations for violent crime, the subculture of poverty theory itself. If poverty creates a vicious cycle of family disruption, incomplete or deviant socialization of children, economic failure, frustration, anger, and violence, then the inheritance of this subculture of poverty to ever-increasing new generations of people caught in this vicious cycle could explain high crime rates. As for the other subcultural explanations, crime rates would have to correlate with poverty rates across different cities for this possibility to remain credible. We should note that they never actually propose to measure any kind of subcultural attitudes in this research. They take a simpler approach, assuming that if the expected outcome, more violent crime concentrated in cities in the South, or cities with larger black populations, or cities with more poverty, then there's no point even to go looking at attitudes, since the result itself would be missing. There would be nothing to explain. Having reviewed a few of these subcultural explanations built on subjective attitudes and values of people, they then turn to their structural alternative. They start with the idea that societies may be more or less ethnically diverse. In a country like Japan, where virtually everyone shares the same ethnicity, this heterogeneity is at a minimum. In the United States, on the other hand, ethnic diversity is perhaps the most complex and extensive of any country on earth. Different ethnic groups may get into conflict with each other over resources in a society, and this could be related to violent crime. We do not, however, suggest that this heterogeneity by itself is the culprit behind high U.S. crime rates. To this horizontal diversity, they add a separate cross-cutting economic dimension. If a society can be more or less diversified horizontally among different ethnic populations, it also can be more or less divided vertically by economic inequality. We can measure such distributions of life chances in many ways, by income, by accumulated wealth resulting from income differences that build up across generations, or even by status or prestige measures that all combine to identify the gap between the rich and the poor. Again, some countries are less unequal in these terms, while the United States had one of the highest levels of inequality between rich and poor 30 years ago, and an even higher level of such inequality today compared to other developed countries. While it is easy to imagine why and how such inequality might be related to violent crime, the Blaus also do not suggest that this stratification and inequality by itself would produce high U.S. crime rates. Their key point is that the real problem emerges if and when the vertical economic inequality and stratification of life chances becomes highly correlated with the horizontal diversification of a population into different ethnic groups. We sometimes tend to think of ethnicity as equivalent to race, and in fact the Blaus measure it this way in their study. But the final diagram here, showing one ethnic group with a concentration of poor people and the other with more wealthy members and few among the poor, could also be a description of the Catholics and Protestants in Belfast, or the immigrants and the native-born Dutch in the cities of the Netherlands. It is the overlap of vertical inequality with horizontal ethnic heterogeneity that the Blaus think might explain why the United States has so much violent crime. You have heard the tale of the Prince and the Pauper as a bedtime story when you were very young. When they discover that they look alike, the Prince and the Pauper exchange places and develop an appreciation for each other's social worlds. However, there is no sense in this story that there never should be such a hierarchical distinction between people in the first place. The world simply comes with princes and paupers. Traditional children's stories often legitimated the divine right of kings and other enduring forms of hereditary stratification of life chances. This is a key point in the logic proposed by Peter and Blau, because they suggest that it is not poverty itself that causes violence. They don't subscribe to the subculture of poverty idea. It may not even be inequality itself that generates violent crime. They suggest that the most dangerous situation is one presenting large inequalities in life chances that people judge to be illegitimate, that is, unjust, unfair, social problems that need to be solved, possibly by violent means if no other solution is possible. There are legitimate inequalities in life, and others that we do not think are legitimate. It is only the second kind that they think might explain violent crime. In American society, we no longer have much use for ideas of hereditary privilege, such as the divine right of kings, but we do still find strong ideological support for some forms of inequality as perfectly legitimate and even desirable. Today, judgments in U.S. society about inequality revolve mostly around whether we think a person has earned special privileges and wealth, and whether an impoverished, miserable person deserves that situation as the consequences of their own decisions and actions. For example, most Americans celebrate the success and wealth of someone like Bill Gates, who came from modest beginnings but built an enormous fortune on the strength of his contributions to the modern information age. We envy his success and wealth, but a large majority of Americans sincerely believe that he deserves every penny of it. His success has been achieved. On the other hand, we can identify other extremely wealthy and successful individuals, such as Carolyn Kennedy, the daughter of former President Kennedy, who may appear to many ordinary Americans as having coasted into her very privileged position in life, mainly by inheriting a vast financial fortune through her family, and also by special treatment and access to the best schools, the best jobs, the best friends, the best neighborhoods, and the best resulting life ever since the day she was born. Her success in many ways was ascribed. That is, it was assigned to her at birth, an almost inevitable byproduct of inherited social position that she did nothing to create herself. There probably is much less consensus in American society about whether this wealth, power, and privilege are legitimate and well-deserved. At the other end of the scale, we may find the mirror image of these judgments about legitimacy for observed situations of poverty and disadvantage. The Blaus suggest that when Americans view either wealth and power, or poverty and powerlessness, as achieved by the individual, they regard either situation as legitimate, and violent crime is totally inappropriate as a reaction to it. When Americans view either wealth and power, or poverty and powerlessness, as being ascribed to individuals by structural forces beyond their control, they are more likely to regard either situation as illegitimate. And when people start to judge inequality as illegitimate, when they begin to judge the rules of the game themselves as rigged and unfair, the situation becomes ripe for violent crime.
And the logical keystone of their entire argument is that ethnicity is mostly an ascribed characteristic. If ethnicity is ascribed, and if ascribed inequalities are unfair, then persistent inequalities that concentrate in certain ethnic groups could very well be the fuel that fires violent crime. Once they have laid out this logical framework, they turn to the question of how they could test all these different explanations to see whether one or more of them has any empirical usefulness in accounting for the actual patterns of violent crime observed in the cities of the United States. They decide to use census data from more than 100 of the largest cities in the United States to compare different cities and look for patterns that might fit each of the possible explanations they consider. Some cities are in the South. If they have higher crime rates not explained by other factors, that would support the Southern subculture of violence argument. The black population is a different percentage of the total population of each city. If the higher crime rates concentrate in the cities with the larger black populations, that might point to the ethnic subculture of violence argument, although this would be a very weak measure for such an argument. After all, we would need to know the ethnicity of the people involved in the crimes, not just the ethnic balance in the total population of the city, to make this idea stick. But if the basic correlation between crime rates and minority percentages is not even there, we don't need to look any further on that score. Finally, the share of the population living in poverty also varies from one city to another. If the crime rates vary across cities in parallel with poverty rates, this might point to the subculture of poverty argument. But again, with all the same warning signals as for an ethnic subculture argument. The census has no information, though, about crimes. We can only find information about the urban population there, the ethnic balance, the extent of poverty, the region where the city is found, and so on. For corresponding information on violent crime, the Blaus turned to the Uniform Crime Reports database maintained by the FBI, which includes reports from police departments all over the country about murders, rapes, robberies, assaults, and other violent incidents. These crime figures can be sorted out by city and used to calculate crime rates. Once this is done, the Blaus are in a position to compare the pattern across cities in crime rates to equivalent patterns in the other measures that they've suggested as possible explanations. Use of the FBI Uniform Crime Reports does raise other potential issues for the validity of this study. Scholars who have looked into the system for collecting these reports have found that the data coming from local police departments around the country do tend to overstate the concentration of crime in poor ethnic neighborhoods, since crimes in affluent white suburbs go unreported more often and never make it into these police statistics. Many researchers today suggest that we get a more accurate picture of the true pattern of violent crime from responses to the Census Bureau's own Crime Victimization Survey, a national survey based on a sample of all households in the population. This survey provides reports from the population that are not filtered through the reporting process of local police departments. But if we assume that the Uniform Crime Reports from the FBI tend to overstate crime in poor minority neighborhoods, where contact with the police is more common, then study results that don't find poverty or ethnicity predicting crime would be even stronger evidence against those subcultural arguments. Across their 125 different metropolitan areas around the United States, Peter and Judith Blau did find some clear patterns in the rate of reported violent crimes per 100,000 people in each city. They only counted violent crimes against persons, not property crimes or white-collar crime, but at least on the surface it looked like the crime rate was higher in southern cities than in other regions of the country. This difference was certainly not big enough to explain contrasts with other countries, since even the regions with the lowest rates were still above rates for those other countries. But by itself this might look like the southern subculture of violence. This single measure taken by itself, however, will not do at all for evidence in their study. The southern cities could have more poverty, higher percentages of black residents, more inequality, and so on. So they create a single model that includes all the possible explanations: the percent in poverty, an indicator for whether the city is in the South or not, the black population as a percentage of the total, the amount of income inequality between rich and poor, and of course their favorite, the degree to which income inequality is correlated with belonging to different ethnic groups. They even add in a measure of family circumstances, though this seems poorly thought out and by far the weakest part of their research design. They include in their model the percent of all people in a city who were counted in the census as divorced. This was supposed to measure family disorganization, since some scholars have linked criminal behavior to growing up in fatherless homes. But the main focus in that research has been on children living with single mothers who were never married in the first place, not children of divorce, so it probably is wisest to pay little or no attention to that aspect of the research conducted by the Blaus. Research on this issue has come a long way in the past 30 years. With all these measures considered together simultaneously, some of them survive and produce statistically significant patterns, while others simply fall out of the model and disappear as plausible arguments. The first to go in their models is the ethnic subculture argument. Once we take account of the economic conditions in different cities, including both poverty and inequality, the black population as a proportion of the total no longer shows any reliable statistical connection to crime rates, so they knock out that possible explanation right from the start. When they compare the simple fact of poverty to the size of the gap between rich and poor, they find that the share of people in a city living in poverty has no power by itself to explain crime rates either, so there goes another of the subcultural explanations. In the table they present to compare these two explanations, we need to be careful to consider the two coefficients under the Greek letter beta rather than the ones under the small b. The numbers on the left refer to very different units of measurement. Only the beta values allow us to compare the two coefficients directly. The r-squared number at the bottom of the table suggests that this model explains about 23% of all variation in crime rates across cities. Coefficients above show that once we add a measure of income inequality, based on the gap between rich and poor, poverty by itself no longer explains anything significant about crime rates. This means that people who look only at poverty, like the person who spray painted the slogan shown here on a concrete wall, are not seeing the whole picture. Ending poverty depends on what we define as poverty, but reducing inequality between rich and poor, no matter how you define poverty, would, the Blaus suggest, also reduce violent crime. Once they have established that inequality between rich and poor seems to be the key problem, rather than ethnic diversity or simple poverty, they are ready to test their main hypothesis, that income inequality that is correlated with ethnic identity is even worse than plain old income inequality among a bunch of undifferentiated individuals. When they include both the plain vanilla measure of income inequality among individuals and also a measure of the correlation of income with race, the r-squared measure at the bottom of their next table increases from 23 to 34%, meaning they have explained significantly more of the variation in violent crime rates. The huge beta coefficient that went along with income inequality in the first table now gets split between the two inequality measures, so that plain inequality by itself now has only about half the effect that it did before. The measure of inequality correlated with ethnicity explains the other half of the variation in crime rates, plus some additional explanatory power of its own, which is why the r-squared value increases too. On the other hand, they also have included in this model their indicator of whether a city was in the South or someplace else, and it is clear from the results that, as in the case of percent black in the population, location in the South has nothing to do with violent crime rates once you also consider the poverty and inequality measures. This study, conducted more than 3 decades ago, is not as complex and sophisticated as such work has become today. But even at this early point in the accumulation of research evidence, the Blaus are able to reach some useful conclusions. First of all, they feel confident in tossing out all 3 of the subcultural explanations some people were offering for violent crime in America. They don't find support for a southern subculture of violence, or an ethnic subculture of urban violence, or even a subculture of poverty that might be linked to violent crime. They have not actually measured any attitudes of people, but they don't feel any need to do this because there are not even any patterns of crime linked to the proposed subgroups of the population that might suggest such subcultural explanations in the first place. Instead, they do find significant support for their suggestion that economic inequality may be a major part of the problem. Quote, "Economic inequalities appear to have even more impact on violent crime than has been hypothesized. Inequalities generally, as well as between races, promote criminal violence." Unquote. They link this finding back to their theoretical idea that inequalities strongly linked to ascribed characteristics like race, rather than to personal achievements of individuals, could make existing inequalities seem unfair and illegitimate, raising even more risk of violent crime as a response. Quote, "In a society founded on the principle that all men are created equal, economic inequalities rooted in ascribed positions violate the spirit of democracy and are likely to create alienation, despair, and conflict." Unquote.